The crowd at the dusty auction yard laughed and hollered as three young women stood trembling on the wagon, their wrists bound, their father shouting prices like they were cattle. $3 for the eldest, 2 for the middle, 1 for the youngest. She's strong, I swear it. But one man wasn't laughing. Jonas Hale, a widowed rancher, stood silent, jaw tight. He saw the shame in the girls' eyes and the desperation in their father's. When no one bid, Jonas stepped forward, tossed a pouch of coins, and said, "I'll take all 3. The crowd jeered, thinking him a fool. But they didn't know Jonas had 3 good sons waiting at home, and a plan that'd change all their lives forever. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The wagon wheels groaned beneath the weight of silence as Jonas guided the team of bay horses west, away from the noise of the auction yard and the stink of cheap whiskey and dust that clung to every shouting face left behind. The road was long and rough, stretching through dry plains that shimmered under the late sun, and the air carried that strange stillness that always followed after cruelty, the kind that pressed on your chest until breathing felt like confession. The 3 sisters sat in the back, their wrists free now, but their fear not yet loosened. Clara, the eldest, sat upright with her jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the horizon as if daring it to give her an answer, while June sat beside her, hands folded in her lap, shoulders rounded like a sparrow caught between storms, and little Annie leaned against her, still trembling from the shame and confusion that had soaked into her bones since their father's voice had turned them into numbers. Jonas said nothing for a long while. He wasn't a man built for talk. His words came slow, like the land itself, and though he could feel their eyes flick toward him now and again, he didn't turn. He just drove, the reins loose in his calloused hands, hat brim low to hide whatever storm of feeling twisted behind his tired blue eyes. The sound of the wagon was all there was. The rhythmic clatter of wheels, the creak of old wood, the occasional snort of a horse. Once, when the road dipped through a dry creek bed, the youngest gasped at the lurch, and Jonas glanced back. "You're safe now," he said, the words simple but carrying more weight than he'd intended. Clara met his gaze for a heartbeat, her chin lifting as if to challenge him, her eyes flaring with the same fire that had made her shout at the auctioneer before the crowd drowned her out. "Safe?" she repeated, her voice sharp. "You bought us like the rest." Jonas didn't flinch. "Bought your freedom," he said evenly. "Not your obedience." The wagon rolled on, and the words hung between them like smoke, confusing, fragile, but not without a spark of something real. June looked up at him then, her eyes wet but curious, as if she were trying to see past the rough lines of his face to the truth of the man beneath. He caught her gaze, then looked back to the trail, his jaw tightening again. The plains stretched wide around them, endless fields of golden grass waving like an ocean in the wind, and far in the distance, the shadow of the Hale Ranch sat against the foothills, a wide, weathered house surrounded by a corral and a half-dozen horses grazing lazily, unaware that fate was rolling toward them in a rickety wagon. As dusk bled across the sky, the first coyotes began to howl, and Annie stirred from where she had dozed against June's arm. "Mister," she murmured softly, her voice small, fragile. "What'll we do when we get there?" Jonas slowed the horses a little, the question hanging in the air. "You'll rest," he said at last. "Eat. Meet my boys." He hesitated before adding, "After that, we'll see." Clara turned away, muttering something too low to hear, but June's gaze lingered on him, searching for the promise in his tone. The ranch lights flickered to life ahead, warm and steady against the encroaching night. Behind him, he could feel the tension in the wagon shifting, not gone, not even softened, but beginning to bend, like iron under heat. Jonas Hale had brought home more than 3 strangers that night. He'd brought home the weight of someone else's sin and a chance, however small, to turn it into something worth forgiving. The last streaks of twilight stretched across the plains as Jonas's wagon rolled into the yard, the ranch dogs barking sharp and fast until the eldest son, Luke, came out from the barn wiping his hands on a rag, squinting through the dust. Behind him, Ben followed, broad-shouldered and frowning, a hammer still in his grip, while young Sam, barely 20 and eager for answers, appeared on the porch with his shirt half tucked and his curiosity plain as the evening star. The wagon creaked to a stop, and the three sisters shifted uneasily, watching the men who'd soon decide whether this place would be sanctuary or another sort of cage. Jonas climbed down slow, boots crunching on gravel, and without a word went to the back to help the girls down one by one. Clara refused his hand, leaping down on her own, chin high and eyes bright with that same defiance that had burned at the auction. June followed carefully, clutching Annie's hand, their bare feet stirring the dust like faint ghosts of the road they'd left behind. Luke's brow furrowed as he looked from his father to the girls, then to his brothers. "Pa," he said finally, the word half a question. "What's this?" Jonas straightened, meeting his son's stares without flinching. "They're staying here," he said simply, voice leaving no room for argument. "You'll treat them with respect. They've had enough shame to last a lifetime." The weight of the words settled heavy on the yard, and for a moment no one spoke. Ben shifted, his jaw working, but one look from his father silenced whatever protest had been forming. Luke sighed, nodding once, his steady, practical nature already turning toward duty. "Ain't saying I understand, Pa," he said, "but all right." Sam, though, couldn't hide the flicker of interest in his eyes. Not the cruel kind the auction men had shown, but the startled kind that comes when youth meets tragedy and doesn't yet know how to carry it. He offered a hesitant smile toward June, who looked away, her cheeks flushing. The house itself seemed to watch them as they entered, old boards creaking under strange feet, the smell of stew and wood smoke still clinging to the rafters. Jonas showed them each to a room, Clara to the small one by the stairs with a window that faced the hills, June and Annie together in the corner room where morning light would spill soft and warm through the thin curtains. Fresh dresses lay folded at the foot of each bed, simple things, worn but clean, stitched long ago by a wife gone too soon. "They belonged to Mary," Jonas said quietly when Clara hesitated. "She'd have wanted someone to use 'em." Clara's hard eyes softened for just a heartbeat before she turned away. Supper was quiet that night. The girls ate slow, unsure if the bounty before them was real or some fragile dream waiting to break. The sons sat stiffly, their manners rusty but sincere, while Jonas ate in silence, his thoughts far away, heavy with the choices that had led him here. Outside, the wind moved through the grass with a whispering sound, as if the plains themselves were curious about this strange arrangement: a widower, his three sons, and three broken daughters of another man's ruin sharing one roof. Yet beneath the unease that hung in the lamplight, something small began to take root, not trust, not yet, but the faint, unfamiliar pulse of hope. For the first time in months, the sisters slept in beds that did not move with the wind, and for the first time in years, the Hale Ranch was filled not with silence, but with the fragile sound of new beginnings. The night settled deep over the plains, the kind that swallows up sound and leaves only the creak of the windmill and the low whistle of the wind across the grass. And inside the Hale Ranch house, the lamplight flickered soft across the dinner table where the air felt thick with everything unsaid. The stew had long since cooled in the bowls, but no one seemed to care much about the food anymore, not when truth began to rise between them like smoke from a fire that refused to die. It was Clara who spoke first, her voice flat and steady, though her eyes burned with the kind of anger that only comes from deep, old wounds. "He lost the farm," she said, her spoon clinking against the bowl. "Lost it to cards, to drink, to whatever fool would listen to his sob story long enough to take the last of what wasn't nailed down. When the debts came due, there weren't no cattle left to sell, just us." The words landed heavy, and for a moment the only sound was the slow, rhythmic ticking of the clock on the mantel. June sat beside her, staring down at her hands, her fingers worrying the hem of the clean dress Jonas's late wife had once sewn, and Annie leaned against her shoulder, small and tired, her eyes hollow but listening. Luke cleared his throat, the weight of discomfort pressing against his natural decency, but before he could speak, Clara went on. "He told us it was just for a while, that we'd be taken in by good folk, that it'd mean food in our bellies and a roof over our heads." Her jaw tightened, and her voice cracked on the next word. "Liar." Jonas had been listening the whole time, elbows on the table, eyes shadowed under the brim of his hat, the lines in his face carved deep from years of loss and work and silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, gravelly. "Some men don't deserve to be called father," he said. And there was something in the way he said it, not pity, not judgment, but a quiet recognition, as if he'd seen that kind of cruelty before and carried his own ghosts because of it. The room went still again. Ben shifted in his chair, uncomfortable with so much hurt in one room, while Luke nodded slowly, his face thoughtful. Sam, though, watched Annie, the smallest of the three, and saw her shiver despite the warmth of the fire. She hadn't touched her bread, hadn't said a word since they'd arrived. When Jonas rose from the table, muttering something about checking the barn, the others drifted off, Clara helping June settle Annie in their shared room, Luke and Ben heading out to finish chores, but Sam lingered, glancing toward the leftover stew still warm in the pot. Later, when the house was quiet and the moonlight poured through the slats of the hallway like silver threads, he crept softly down to the kitchen, filled a plate, and tiptoed to the girls' door. He knocked once, barely a whisper. Annie looked up, wide-eyed, when he slipped inside and set the plate on the table beside the bed. "Didn't reckon you ate enough," he said quietly, smiling in that shy way boys do when kindness feels like something they have to hide. For a second, she just stared at him, unsure. Then her small fingers reached for the bread, breaking it slowly. When she glanced up, her eyes met his wary, searching, and then, like a fragile beam of sunlight breaking through a storm, she smiled. Just a little, but enough to make the whole dark house feel warmer. Out in the hallway, Jonas paused, unseen, watching from the shadows, and for the first time in years, he felt something he'd nearly forgotten, the shape of a sense that maybe, just maybe, his home could still heal what the world had broken. The mornings came early at the Hale Ranch, dawn spilling over the plains in soft pink light that touched the frost on the fence posts and shimmered against the dewdrops clinging to the tall grass. On the first morning after the truth had been spoken, Jonas had them all up before the rooster even finished its first crow, his gravelly voice carrying through the hall with the kind of authority no one dared argue with. "Work'll keep you steady," he said, standing by the doorway with his coffee steaming in hand, his eyes sweeping across the table where the sisters sat blinking sleep from their eyes, and the boys looked half dead from the hour. Idle hands ain't ever healed a soul. And so, under the pale sky, the rhythm of labor began. Clara took to the fence lines first, sleeves rolled up past her elbows, her hair tied back in a messy knot. Luke, who'd figured no woman from town would last an hour mending barbed wire, found himself eating his words by noon. She matched his pace nail for nail, her glare cutting sharper than the wind every time he offered to lend a hand. By the second day, they were arguing about cattle prices, Luke claiming he knew the markets from Dodge to Abilene, Clara insisting she'd spent years doing her father's books while he drank away their profits, and though their voices rose like thunder, the spark between them burned with something that wasn't quite anger. June found her place in quieter corners. She started in the kitchen, then drifted to the porch, where Ben often sat sharpening tools and squinting at old ledgers he could barely read. When she realized it, she smiled softly and took a seat beside him, her voice patient as she guided his finger along the faded words. "You read it fine," she told him, her tone kind but firm. "Just gotta let the letter speak slower." He tried, stumbling at first, then smoother, his deep voice rolling over the syllables while she nodded in approval. Soon, it became their ritual evenings by lamplight, her reading from the Bible or a worn novel while he listened, sometimes mouthing the words, sometimes just watching her lips form them. And for Annie, sweet, timid Annie, the ranch became her song. She followed Sam to the stables each afternoon, her voice rising in soft, lilting tunes while he sat nearby with his harmonica, playing along between chores. It started by accident, a tune hummed under her breath as she brushed a mare, answered by the soft, playful whistle of his harmonica. But soon it became a duet that filled the air between them with something unspoken and healing. Even the horses seemed to listen, their ears twitching to the rhythm. By the end of the week, laughter cautious at first, but real had begun to creep back into the house. Supper came with stories, teasing, the clatter of plates, and the rare sound of Jonas chuckling behind his mustache. The weight of the past hadn't vanished, but it no longer ruled the air like a ghost. The sisters were sunburned and sore, the boys less guarded, and the ranch long haunted by absence began to feel alive again. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills and painted the sky with fire, Jonas leaned on the porch rail, watching them, Clara and Luke still bickering near the corral, June and Ben laughing quietly over a book, Annie sitting on the fence with her feet swinging while Sam played a slow, sweet tune. The sound carried over the fields like a prayer, soft and sure. For the first time in years, Jonas thought maybe the land wasn't cursed after all. Maybe it just needed hearts brave enough to work it back to life. The wind carried the smell of rain that morning, thick and heavy as the storm brewing in the distance. But the real trouble wasn't in the sky. It rode into town on a lame bay horse with whiskey on its breath and bitterness in its bones. Silas Granger, the man who'd once called himself a father, stumbled down Main Street like a ghost that refused to stay buried. His clothes were filthy, his beard tangled, and his eyes burned with that dangerous light that comes when a man's pride hurts worse than his hangover. By noon, everyone in town had heard him shouting outside the saloon, telling anyone who'd listen how the widowed rancher Jonas Hale had bought his daughters clean off the wagon block. The crowd, ever hungry for scandal, laughed, then whispered, then believed. Silas puffed up his chest, slamming his bottle on the hitching rail. He took 'em. He spat. Bought 'em for himself, and his boys said he'd save 'em. You call that charity? Hell, that's a harem dressed in Sunday manners. The lie spread like prairie fire in dry grass. By evening, Sheriff Clay had heard it twice over, once from the saloon keeper, once from the preacher's wife, and by the time he rode out toward the Hale ranch, thunder had already started rumbling on the horizon. Jonas met him on the porch, calm but wary, his sleeves rolled up and his eyes steady. The sheriff dismounted, brushing dust from his coat, his face grave. "Evenin', Jonas," he said, voice level. "We need to talk." Inside, the girls had paused in their chores, the tension settling like a shadow across the room. Clara stood by the window, watching every move. June took Annie's hand without thinking, her knuckles white. Jonas motioned for Clay to sit, though neither man did. "I've heard talk in town," the sheriff began, "about how you came to have those girls here." Jonas's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed even. "You heard wrong. Maybe, Clay," aloud. "But it's a damn loud wrong. Folks are saying Silas Granger wants his daughters back. Says you took what's his." Jonas's laugh came out low, bitter. "What's his? He sold them, Clay, same as he'd sell a steer. You saw that auction same as I did." The sheriff nodded slowly, hat in hand. "I did. And I know you well enough to believe you ain't done nothing unholy. But Granger's been running his mouth, stirring up men who'd love a reason to turn a rifle on this ranch. Word is he's sober enough now to be dangerous." Jonas's gaze hardened. "He comes here, he won't find a welcome." "He'll come," Clay said, his tone soft but certain. "A man like that can't stand losing what he thinks he owns. And you, Jonas, you've made enemies by trying to do right." For a long moment, the two men stood in silence, the storm clouds above echoing the tension between them. Then the sheriff replaced his hat, eyes full of something that wasn't quite warning and wasn't quite pity. "You've got a good thing going here," he said quietly. "Don't let it burn because of another man's sins. Watch your fences. Keep a gun close." When he rode away, the thunder rolled closer, and the sky split open with the first drops of rain. Inside, Jonas closed the door and leaned against it, staring at the floor. The sound of the storm filled the house, rain drumming the roof, wind whistling through the eaves, and behind him, the three sisters waited for him to speak. Finally, he looked up, his voice heavy but steady. "Looks like the past found us again," he said. "But it won't take you this time." Outside, lightning lit the yard, and for one fleeting second, Clara saw the look in his eyes, the same fierce, unbreakable resolve that had once made a man stand up in a crowd and say three words that had changed all their lives. "I'll take all three." The night came down heavy and thick, the air so still it felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. And out on the dark horizon the sound of hooves began to rise, faint at first, then steady. The rhythm of a storm made of men instead of thunder. Inside the Hale house, lamps still burned low, their glow soft against the wooden walls, but Jonas already knew what was coming. He'd felt it in his bones since sundown, that shift in the wind that told an old rancher when trouble was on the move. He rose from his chair by the fire, the weight of age and duty on his shoulders, and looked to Luke, who stood near the window with his rifle already in hand. "They're comin'," Luke murmured, his jaw tight. Outside, the horses' hooves grew louder, a dozen, maybe more, and then voices carried through the night, sharp and mean. The kind of voices that belonged to men who had drunk their courage and were now looking to spend it. "Hail!" a shout rang out from the yard. "Bring out the girls. They ain't yours to keep." Jonas opened the door, the wind catching his coat as he stepped out onto the porch. The moon hung full and white above the plains, throwing long shadows across the yard where half a dozen riders sat mounted, their faces hard and lit by lantern glow. At the front, swaying in his saddle, was Silas Granger, his beard matted, his eyes wild, his hand gripping a pistol that gleamed like a snake's fang in the dark. "Evenin', Silas," Jonas said, his voice calm, though the air around him crackled with danger. "Didn't figure you'd have the gall to show your face here again." Silas spat into the dirt. "You think you can steal what's mine, you old fool? You think buying them makes you better than me?" Jonas stepped down from the porch, slow and deliberate, his hands empty, his voice steady as the earth beneath him. "You lost your say when you sold your own blood," he said. "You don't get to call yourself father. After that." The words hit like a hammer. The men shifted uneasily. Glancing at each other, they weren't here for righteousness, only revenge. And deep down, they knew it. But pride is a stubborn poison, and Silas's pride was already eating him alive. "You think you can shame me, Hale?" he snarled. "You think them girls belong with you livin' fat while I rot?" His hand twitched toward his gun. "Don't," Jonas warned quietly, eyes never leaving his face. But the drunk was past reason. His pistol came halfway out of its holster when the night split with a single crack. Luke's rifle fired from the porch, the bullet striking true, sending Silas tumbling from his horse into the dirt. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then chaos exploded. Gunfire tore through the quiet. Horses reared. Men shouted the sharp, violent language of panic and fury. Luke ducked behind a post and fired again, while Ben came running from the barn with his shotgun blazing, the sound echoing across the hills. Jonas dove for cover behind a trough, yelling for June and Annie to stay inside, while Clara grabbed the rifle from the wall and took position at the window, her aim steady and her eyes cold. "Down!" Luke shouted, firing into the dark as another rider's lantern shattered, spilling fire into the grass. The fight was quick but brutal, the kind of chaos that lasted seconds but felt like eternity. When it was over, the smell of gunpowder hung thick in the air, and two bodies lay still in the moonlight. The rest of the men, the ones who'd come out of greed rather than loyalty, fled into the hills, their shouts fading into the distance. Jonas rose slowly, his breath heavy, his heart pounding. Silas Granger lay on his back in the dirt, blood pooling dark beneath him, eyes wide with the bitter realization that his hate had finally cost him everything. The wind picked up then, cold and clean, blowing through the yard as if to clear away the smoke and the ghosts. Jonas looked around at his sons, Luke grim-faced but unshaken, Ben reloading in silence, Sam trembling slightly though trying to hide it, and then at the cabin, where the sisters waited by the window, safe but shaken. "It's done," he said quietly, voice rough with grief and relief alike. "Ain't no man takin' what's under my roof again." The moon shone pale over the ranch, lighting the bodies, the blood, and the hard, unforgiving peace that comes only after survival. The silence that followed the gunfire was almost unbearable, a hollow stillness that made the night itself seem to hold its breath, broken only by the faint hiss of wind sweeping over the plains and the distant, panicked cries of horses fleeing into the dark. Smoke hung low over the yard, curling through the pale moonlight, and the smell of gunpowder and blood clung to everything: the earth, the fence posts, the very air. The Hale men stood where they were, weapons still in hand, hearts pounding with the kind of adrenaline that doesn't fade quickly. Then, from the cabin doorway, the sisters appeared, faces pale in the flickering light, nightgowns brushing the dirt as they stepped out into the aftermath of violence. Annie clung to June's arm, eyes wide with shock, while Clara moved past them, slow and unsteady, drawn by some invisible force toward the figure lying motionless in the dust. Her father's chest still rose and fell, but barely. The blood that soaked through his coat glistened black beneath the moon, pooling around him like spilled ink. She dropped to her knees beside him, the anger she'd carried for months tangled with grief she hadn't known she still possessed. His eyes fluttered open, cloudy and dim, and when they found hers, the hatred was gone, burned out like the last ember of a long-dead fire. "Clara," he rasped, his voice ragged and small, as if he were already half in another world. She swallowed hard, unable to speak. "I only ever wanted money," he whispered, coughing weakly. "Thought it'd make me something more than what I was." He looked past her then, toward the house glowing faintly in the distance. "But you found better." His hand, shaking and cold, lifted slightly before falling back to the earth. "You got out." Clara's breath hitched. For a long moment, she just stared at him, torn between anger, sorrow, and a strange, aching pity. Then she reached out, her hand trembling, and pressed it against his cheek. "And we forgive you anyway," she said softly. His lips twitched, almost a smile, and then the last breath left him, quiet as a sigh. The wind stirred the grass, and the world went still again. Behind her, June began to cry quietly, muffled sobs that Annie tried to soothe, though her own tears fell freely. Jonas stepped forward, boots crunching over the dry earth, his rifle still slung over his shoulder. He stopped beside Clara, his shadow falling across her as she gently closed her father's eyes. For a long while, he said nothing, just stood there with the solemn patience of a man who'd seen too much death and too many broken hearts. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, rough, but steady. "You did more for him than he ever did for you." Clara looked up at him through tear-streaked lashes, her face streaked with dust and grief. And though she didn't answer, he saw the truth there. She hadn't forgiven the man for his sake, but for her own. She rose slowly, wiping her hands on her skirt, and glanced toward her sisters. June was holding Annie close, whispering something too soft to hear, and for the first time since the auction, they looked like a family again, not broken, not owned, just surviving. Jonas turned his gaze toward the hills, where the remaining men had disappeared into the darkness. "They won't be back," he muttered. Luke nodded grimly, his rifle still in hand. "Not after tonight." The moon dipped lower, the light turning silver and faint, and the fire in the lamp by the porch guttered weakly before going out. The night had taken much blood, pieces of the past, but what remained was something sturdier, forged in pain and fire, the quiet, stubborn will to live. As Jonas placed his hand on Clara's shoulder, the same way a father would steady a child, she let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. "Come morning," he said gently. "We'll bury him proper, then we start again." She nodded, staring down at the man who'd once owned her fate, and whispered to the wind, "This time, we start free." The weeks that followed the blood and smoke of that terrible night came like a balm over wounded skin, slow and tender, the land itself seeming to exhale after holding its breath too long. Spring pressed its fingers into the plains, painting the dry hills green again, and the Hale Ranch breathed with new life, the fences mended, the horses sleek, the laughter of young voices mingling with the calls of meadowlarks at dawn. It began quietly, with small moments that grew roots in the soil of peace. Luke and Clara still argued. Of course they wouldn't have known how not to, but the edge in their voices softened, replaced by a teasing warmth that neither of them seemed to understand, but neither wanted to lose. He'd find her out by the cattle pens, hands on her hips, lecturing him about grazing rotation, and he'd roll his eyes just to make her scowl, but by the time the sun dipped low, she'd be laughing at his stubbornness, and he'd be smiling at the way her hair caught the light. One evening, he handed her a ledger and said, "You handle the books, you're better at it." It wasn't quite a confession, but the look they shared said what words couldn't. In the house, June and Ben had found their own rhythm. She'd turned the parlor into a small library of borrowed books, teaching him to read with a patience that could tame a wild horse. He'd stumble through the words, cheeks reddening as she corrected him softly. And by the time he got it right, she'd smile in that quiet, approving way that made his heart thud like a hammer. Some nights, after everyone had gone to bed, she'd still be reading aloud, her voice a low, soothing hum under the crackle of the fire. It wasn't long before Ben started carving her a bookshelf from pine rough around the edges, but sturdy, like the way he loved her. And Sam and Annie, well, they were inseparable. They worked side by side in the stables, brushed down the horses together, shared apples, under the shade of the old oak behind the barn. Sam's harmonica was never far from his pocket, and whenever he played, Annie would hum along, her voice still soft but growing stronger every day. Once, Jonas caught them dancing just a slow, swaying step in the barn, her bare feet on his boots, both of them grinning like fools. He didn't interrupt, just watched from the doorway, smiling to himself before walking back out into the quiet evening. The ranch itself seemed lighter now, the ghosts of the past laid to rest in the fields where new grass grew tall and forgiving. Jonas spent most of his days working with his sons, his nights sitting on the porch, pipe in hand, watching the house glow from within, warm light spilling through the windows, laughter drifting into the cool air. He thought often of Mary, his late wife, and how she would have loved the noise, the fullness, the way the place finally felt alive again. One night, as the family sat gathered by the fire, Luke and Clara quietly playing cards, Ben reading with June, Sam whittling while Annie embroidered something in her lap, Jonas leaned back in his chair, his weathered face lit soft by the glow. "Guess I didn't just buy lives back," he said, his voice low but carrying over the fire's gentle crackle. "I built a family." For a moment no one spoke, then Clara looked up and met his gaze, smiling the way a daughter might. "No, Mr. Hale," she said softly. "You just gave one a home." Outside, the wind rustled through the grass like a whispered blessing, and for the first time in as long as anyone could remember, the Hale Ranch didn't just feel like a house on the prairie, it felt like the heart of something whole. The morning sun rose golden and soft over the Hale Ranch, spilling warmth across the plains and glinting off the wet grass left by last night's rain. And from every direction came the sound of live horses nickering in their pens, chickens clucking near the fence, and the distant murmur of voices filled with laughter and nervous joy. The ranch had never looked so alive. Beneath the wide arms of the old cottonwood tree, the one that had stood long before any Hale had driven a post into this land, white ribbons fluttered in the breeze, and wildflowers were woven into garlands that framed the small clearing like something out of a dream. The whole valley had come to see it. The weddings of Jonas Hale's sons to the three sisters he'd once rescued from a dusty auction block. Old neighbors, ranch hands, and townsfolk who'd once whispered about scandal now smiled and nodded, their hats in hand, their faces warm with admiration. Clara stood at the front, radiant in a dress stitched from flour sacks, bleached and patched until they shone white as any fine gown. Her hair was pinned up with sprigs of prairie bloom, her hands steady despite the tears she fought to hold back. Luke stood opposite her, looking both proud and terrified, his best coat pressed and his boots polished within an inch of their life. When she met his gaze, he grinned that crooked grin that had once infuriated her, and now, somehow, melted her every time. Beside them, June and Ben whispered softly, fingers intertwined, their love quiet but unshakable, like the roots of the cottonwood itself. June's veil was a simple strip of lace torn from an old curtain, and Ben had made her a wooden ring carved from the very tree under which they stood. "So it won't ever break," he'd said shyly when he'd given it to her. And then there were Sam and Annie, the youngest pair, standing closest to the sunlight. She wore her hair loose, a crown of daisies woven by her sisters resting atop it, and Sam could hardly stop smiling long enough to say his vows. His harmonica peeked from his vest pocket, ready for the song he'd promised to play her when the preacher said, "Man and wife." Jonas stood a little apart, watching them all with eyes that shone beneath his weathered hat brim. The preacher from town, a kind old man who'd known the Hale family for decades, lifted his voice above the murmuring wind. "3 unions," he said, "born not of bargain, but of choice forged through trial, tested by grace." The crowd fell quiet, every face turned toward the couples. The vows were simple, spoken in trembling voices and answered with smiles that carried the weight of all they'd endured. When the preacher declared them married, the cheer that went up rolled across the valley like thunder, laughter spilling out from the yard, mingling with the call of meadowlarks. Sam raised his harmonica and played a tune so full of joy that even the oldest men clapped along, tapping boots against the dirt. The sisters danced barefoot in the grass, their white skirts catching the wind, and the Hale boys joined them, clumsy and happy, their laughter ringing out across the fields. The smell of roasted meat and fresh bread drifted from the house, where neighbors had laid out a feast fit for a kingdom. As the sun began to set, painting the world in fire and gold, Jonas sat on the porch, pipe in hand, watching the six of them dance beneath the cottonwood. A faint smile tugged at his lips, and he murmured to himself, "Didn't reckon this old place would ever see such joy again." When Clara caught sight of him, she ran up, threw her arms around his neck, and whispered, "You gave us a life, Mr. Hale." He shook his head, his voice thick. "No, girl, you all gave this place its heart back." The wind rustled through the branches above them, scattering petals over the newlyweds below like blessings from the sky. And as the music and laughter filled the branches above them, night, the Hale Ranch, once a place of solitude and ghosts, became a living legend, a home reborn through love that refused to die. Years turned slow and golden across the plains, the seasons spinning like dust in sunlight, and what had once been a lonely patch of land beneath a wide, merciless sky grew into something that lived and breathed with warmth, the Hale Ranch, now a haven known for miles in every direction. The cottonwood tree still stood where the 3 weddings had been held, its branches broader, its shade deeper, the carvings of initials in its bark faded by time but never forgotten. Under its limbs, children played Luke and Clara's boys, chasing June and Ben's daughters through the tall grass, while Sam and Annie's youngest sat strumming a small harmonica, a sound that carried like laughter on the wind. The house had aged, but proudly, its porch worn smooth by countless boots and rocking chairs, its windows glowing each night with the soft amber of lamplight. Time had carved lines into Jonas Hale's face, silvered his hair, and slowed his step. But it had done nothing to dim the steady light in his eyes. Most days found him sitting on that porch, pipe in hand, watching the horizon with the calm of a man who'd seen both the worst and best of the world and found peace somewhere in between. Folks from all over stopped by, drifters, widows, soldiers returned from war with nothing but their shadows, families down on luck and looking for a place to start again. The stories always began the same: hunger, hardship, loss. And they always ended with the same gesture: a warm meal at the table, a cot in the barn, and the quiet kindness of a family that had made room where others turned away. It became a saying across the valley: "Go to Hale's, and you'll find mercy." Sometimes, the preacher would bring newcomers himself, smiling as he dismounted his horse. "Jonas'll set you right," he'd say. "He's got more mercy than money, but that's worth more these days." And Jonas, slow to rise but steady, would tip his hat and answer in that same gravel-rough drawl he'd used for years. "Mercy don't cost you nothing, but it sure can buy back a soul." He said it so often that even the children repeated it like a hymn, their voices ringing through the yard on summer evenings while their parents worked the fields. The ranch never grew rich, but it never wanted for anything either. There was always bread on the table, always laughter in the house, and always someone new finding their way back to hope. The sisters aged with grace, their hands still busy with work, and their eyes soft with memory. Clara, fierce as ever, ran the books and the herd with Luke. June kept the home filled with books and music. Annie taught every child in the valley to read, her gentle patience becoming a legend of its own. And Sam's harmonica still played at dusk, the same tune he'd once played under the cottonwood when love was young and the world was uncertain. On quiet nights, Jonas would sit alone after the lamps went out, the stars spilling across the black prairie sky, and think of that day long ago, the dusty auction yard, the trembling sisters, the crowd's laughter. He'd remember the moment he'd stepped forward, when he didn't know why exactly, only that it felt like something bigger than choice. Maybe fate, maybe faith. "I'll take all 3, he'd said then. And in the long years that followed, he'd learned that mercy, the kind that asks for nothing, the kind that gives everything, had been the truest bargain he'd ever made. When he finally passed, he did so sitting on that same porch, the sunset painting the sky gold and crimson. The family buried him beneath the cottonwood tree beside Mary, his late wife, and carved his words into the stone that marked his rest: "Mercy don't cost you nothing, but it sure can buy back a soul." And from that day on, every traveler who found their way to the Hale Ranch knew that mercy still lived there, steady as the wind across the plains, carried on in the hearts of those who'd learned its worth.